During the unit, the Roaring Twenties, we will be looking at obviously the period, the decade of the 1920s, but it's a transition from the end of World War One and into the stock market crash of 1929 that will bring an end to the Roaring Twenties. With the war over and the battle that ensued between the President and the Senate over the Treaty of Versailles and America's place in that treaty and America's place in the world at that point, a lot of Americans were, as it says here, exhausted. Um, it's our first time we'd been involved in the European discussions to that level, and it's also that we've come to an end of that progressive period where the constant reforming of our government. The 19 teens were a very active political time, and a lot of Americans were ready for that to be over. The League of Nations debate was going to be a big part of this as well because, again, it's the president battling with Congress. It's the president battling with the Senate. We've seen that in recent years with the president battling with the House of Representatives. We see that going on right now as we're dealing with the budgetary fiscal issues. And American people, just in general, we have a short attention span for those things. It's not just something that we see in modern America, but we want to move past that. We've had enough, and that long drawn out debate and discussion over the League of Nations, we need to move past it. Progressive era coming to an end. We've been fixing things for almost 20 years. As we reach the 1920s, right after the war, we think about the progressive period, we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt when it hit national level. But the progressives were hitting, were this the old populist movement of the 1890s. We've been looking at, in some areas, reforming for 20 years. And at some point in time, you have to stop fixing things and see where you're at. So we see that going on in the 1920s, in the early stages. Economic issues, while the Roaring Twenties are typically, we think about them as the booming economy, the robust civilization that we had going on then. That initial transition from the war to peacetime, we will see some economic issues. The things I have mentioned here. Unemployment. We've got 4+ million soldiers that are in the military. What are we going to do with them? Now, not all of them will be coming home. Some will be staying in the military. We are going to have an enhanced military presence in other locations. We're going to stay in Europe until the treaty is signed in 21. But the reality is, out of those 4 million, the 2+ million draftees, those guys are going to be coming home. They want their jobs back. What about the people who filled those jobs during the war years? So we're going to see those issues. Just the general switch from wartime to peacetime. While plants and factories are retooling the machinery, there's going to be a lull. There's going to be some downtime in those industries. And because of that, there will be some inflation. During the war, there were fewer consumer goods to purchase. People had money to buy them. But because there's fewer things to buy and more people with money, that's going to cause those prices to go up. They're willing to pay more. But that inflation, the cost of buying things going up while others are losing their jobs, it's going to cause some economic, not going to go to a full-fledged Great Depression yet, but we'll see a recession. So there's going to be those. Politically, I like to believe there's 3 major trends that take place in this period. And I've got those listed there at the bottom of the slide. A renewed isolationism. Again, this is the first time we really have left our hemisphere and got involved in other people's business. People talk about it all the time. Why do we need to be involved? Why do we need to be doing that? A lot of the reasons for us being involved in world affairs today stem from our lack of involvement during this period. The United States, a lot of Americans didn't like being involved. The war was bloody. It was horrendous. The casualties, not just soldiers, the civilian loss of life. They don't want to be messing with that anymore. They don't want to be a part of that. So we will see the United States kind of pull back within our own borders. The resurgence of nativism. Okay, we're not going to like the outsiders much. Again, it goes back to that idea that we're going to, we've got these immigrants. We've got to have there's a lot of displaced people after World War I, and they're going to look for a place to be. And where else to go? The United States was one of those places that, we've got the Statue of Liberty out there in the harbor. We've been welcoming immigrants for years. Give us your cold, your tired, your huddled masses, as the poem says on the Statue of Liberty. America was the golden door of opportunity. But that doesn't mean that after the war, we were really that ready to embrace them. And again, when you bring in immigrants, you bring in their baggage, you bring in their problems, you bring in their cultural ideas. We wanted to kind of get back to us. And the last is an area of political conservatism. Again, we'd had Roosevelt for 6+ years. We'd had 4 years of Taft. While Taft was much more conservative than Roosevelt or Wilson, he was still more progressive than most Republicans. He was still a trust buster. Okay, so those things, again, 8 years into Wilson on top of it, we were ready for let the government take a step back. America was ready for government to get out of everybody's business. They were looking for a smaller government, less regulations. Let's go, let's see where we're at kind of a mood. So the end of the progressivism, and let's go with this era of conservatism. And economically, laissez-faire will be back. We're going to let the market dictate things. We're going to let the people choose. So, but the post-war going to have these political issues, going to have some international issues. We're not going to be so isolationist that we don't even talk to allies and things like that. We're still going to be involved in some treaties and the like, but the mood of the people, much more on the side of that war. Okay, yeah, let's get back to where we used to be and not messing in world affairs. All right, after the war was over, we're going to see an increase in some union and labor unrest and labor issues. During the war, we had the War Labor Relations Board that was trying to be that liaison between the labor side and government, big business, because we didn't want to see things get in the way of the war issue or the war production, the war effort. War's over. And groups that had felt like they were doing their patriotic duty of not striking, during the war effort, now it's their time. They expect, hey, wages need to go up. We've been working hard. We deserve our, what's right. For the most part, post-war administration is going to favor management. Again, the propaganda there, the American way. Understand that big business, newspapers, a lot of advertising, people who aren't in the manufacturing side of it, people who don't work in those positions aren't going to understand all the intricacies of the business world, and what they read in the paper, a lot of cases are going to believe. But the unions are looking for that living wage. They're looking for their salaries to increase to the level of the inflation. See some numbers here. In 1919, there were 3,600 strikes alone. Also, you're going to see an increased activity with the radicals, the radical side of things. In 1919, there's also 36 bombs, or mail bombs sent to businesses. So that's going on. Um, Boston police strike. Um, this is mentioned mainly because um, what we get out of it. In 1919, the police force there in Boston, Massachusetts, go on strike. They had not received a wage since before the beginning of World War I, and by 1919, that cost of living had doubled. And there were a handful of officers, or a group of officers, that had been fired because they joined a union. They had joined the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. So the response was, those guys got fired for joining a union. The rest of the police force went on strike. They got the old blue flu. Well, the governor of Massachusetts stepped in, had them all fired, brought in the National Guard to handle the police matters, and famously saying, there's no right to strike against the public safety by anyone, anywhere, anytime. And Calvin Coolidge gets a lot of national attention for that, so much so that in the 1920 presidential race, the Republicans put him on the ticket as the vice president. So he's going to make a name for himself nationally. Another one of the major strikes of 1919 was U.S. Steel, Carnegie's old company that's now being run by the group that J.P. Morgan had put together. Difficult and dangerous. You think about that, and the long hours, and the pay was just barely allowing them to continue, to keep up. I mean, some of them you're looking at 12-hour days, 7 days a week, and in September of 1919, some 350,000 steel workers walked out. Okay. They hired strikebreakers. They used force. There will be an altercation. There's, I believe, 18 killed during the altercation. The owners are going to use the media. They're going to use the propaganda. And President Wilson attempted to get a peaceful resolution, but the strike will eventually be broken in 1920. It wasn't until 1923 that the public began to actually realize that the workers were right, that the working conditions and the pay were as bad as they had said. But by then it's too late. Public opinion will be utilized by the owners in a lot of these cases to keep the opinion of the general U.S. public that these labor unions were wrong. And they're going to draw a direct connection between these labor unions and the growing communist movement in Europe. In the 1880s, 1890s, big business had done a pretty good job of drawing a connection between the labor movements and the anarchists. And there were anarchists in America. There were anarchist groups that were part of some of the radical unions. So in some cases, it's easier to make those connections than others, but not all unions are bad. Not all unions were connected to those groups. But again, using the media connections, using the money and their influence, they're going to continue to try to paint all unions in a negative light. And the labor issues are going to continue to be a problem. We also see during this period some increased racial tension. When we talked about World War I, we talked about the Great Migration and the fact that there were going to be more and more African Americans moving into the northern cities looking for those industrial jobs as part of the war effort. And that's just going to add to the racial tension in the United States. And a lot of the racial tension that had been typically, you saw in the South, we're going to start seeing more and more of it in the North. Rivalries over jobs, the African Americans moving into neighborhoods, that had been traditionally white. In the cities, it's that tension is going to be brought to a larger level. I mean, again, go back to when we talked about the populists versus progressives. We said one of the main reasons that progressives were successful was the urban mainstream part of it. Well, a lot of the racial issues in the South, you're dealing with some more rural areas.